Good evening, everybody. We are so glad to welcome you to Central Library tonight. This is just, I think, going to be a really great conversation, and we are thrilled that you are here to be a part of it. My name is Gail Thomas Strong. I work on the community engagement team at WFYI, and we are offering tonight our 30th conversation about education. I'm looking at Melanie Whistle, our great partner from the library. We've had 30 of these kinds of conversations over the last 5 years designed to help build awareness about issues that are complicated, to help deepen understanding, and then we hope help folks understand how to take action on those issues. So this became a way for us to engage in civil dialogue with folks at a time when it just seemed like we all needed to know more about education and what was real for children. So your presence here tonight is something we really appreciate. Tonight's conversation we're doing in partnership with our good friends at Chalkbeat, Indiana, and we are thrilled that they have brought their reporting expertise to this conversation. As you see, we are recording it for use on WFYI. It won't be posted tomorrow. We'll tidy it up just a half a smidge in case somebody sneezes or something. But it will be available on WFYI's website, on our YouTube channel in just a couple days. And we hope that that will provide an opportunity for you to engage even more people in this conversation. You'll be able to follow tonight's dialogue on Twitter, and we're using the hashtag #AmGradIndy. You may actually submit questions via Twitter tonight, and we're also doing it the old-fashioned, very low-tech way with index cards. So Angie and I will be about to distribute those if that's a need that you have when Shana hits that moment. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Shana Cavazos. I hope that many of you read her reports on Chalkbeat, Indiana. She's a skilled reporter coming to us from the Missouri School of Journalism. She's also reported for the Columbia Missourian and the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Dealer, I got it right. I thought, wait, I'm talking about something I shouldn't be, maybe. Cleveland Plain Dealer, and I've read that paper. I'm sorry, Shana. For Chalkbeat, one of Shana's beats is state standards. She also covers testing, teaching, and other issues. Shana will be introducing our guest tonight, and we look forward to this conversation. Thank you. Shana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank Gail and Carly and Melanie, everyone at WFYI and the Indianapolis Public Library who've been such great partners for us in doing these events. Maybe you've been to one before. Also, I want to thank our sponsors tonight, the Mind Trust and the Institute for Quality Education. They have sponsored a few events like this, and we always appreciate their support. So like Gail said, I am the state policy reporter for Chalkbeat, and if you're not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit news website. We cover education policy for K-12 in Indianapolis and Marion County, and then policy across the state. So like Gail said, please use Twitter. Please think of questions that you might have so that we can have an even more detailed, robust discussion later on. So tonight, we're here obviously to talk about testing, and specifically, we're talking about the end of ISTEP. But you know, there's still a lot of questions around what's going to happen next, not just for educators and parents and students, but for the whole state and for policymakers. And so hopefully we can get at some of those things tonight. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on kind of how we got to this point. So if you haven't been keeping up with our coverage on this, this is your chance to tune in and learn a little bit. So briefly, for those of you who are involved with education, you know that the last year has been a little rough when it comes to testing. In 2015, we saw some different scoring delays and some technical issues that also delayed our state's release of A to F grades, and in turn, held up pay raises for teachers across the state as well. And some of those things were a big driver of what led lawmakers to pass this past legislative session, House Bill 1395, which was the law that said we're getting rid of ISTEP after 2017 and looking at something new for 2018. But it really wasn't the first time that Indiana's made a transition like this. iStep is a pretty old test. We've been using it for decades. And then in 2014, when the state got ready to leave Common Core, we thought we were headed toward a Common Core line test, but that didn't pan out. So we kind of had to shore up iStep to meet the state's new academic standards. And after that, in 2016, we moved to a new test vendor, Pearson, and they'll be the same vendor that we used for 17, and 18 is kind of when we start over. So if you've been paying attention to legislation, you'll know that we have a new state panel who has been put together, appointed by lawmakers and other policymakers from across the state, picking educators and teachers and school leaders and other education professionals in Indiana to kind of help us chart a new course. So that's kind of a little bit where we are. Still a little bit vague, so I'm hoping you guys can help elaborate for us on what's going on. And let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Senator Pete Miller from Avon. He has been a member of the Senate Education Committee for 4 years. Next, we have Danielle Shockey, who's Indiana's Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction. We have Cynthia Roach, who is the Testing and Accountability Director for the Indiana State Board of Education. And we have Chad Mihalik, the Assessment Director in Washington Township. So just to kind of start off, the first thing that I wanted to ask you guys, and I'll ask that you each kind of weigh in, is, as we get started having these discussions about what Indiana's new state test should look like, what is the most important thing that you think we should keep in mind? So we'll start with you, Senator Miller.
Just to start out, I want to make clear for those in the audience that may not know this, but I lost my primary last week, so I'm bad news and good news. Bad news is I can't really implement any of the good things we talk about tonight. The good news, I can be as candid as I've ever been before, so don't have to hold back. I guess my overriding thing would be that we need to look at testing holistically and how this fits in with all of the other policy in education. You mentioned the change in standards from Common Core, and I think there was a political move to just get rid of Common Core, which we did, but no one stopped to say, well, what's the impact of that on testing? And that's creating a lot of constraints that I'm sure we'll talk about tonight. In the same way, whatever testing that we decide on is going to have a big impact on accountability and other things. So I'm sure there'll be a move to get rid of iStep and so forth. That's not enough. We need to make sure that we evaluate how it will impact other things before we just move on to a different test.
I guess I would say at the department, we're most excited about those other things. We're excited about, we'll talk a lot tonight about the opportunities around the assessment redesign and what's allowable under ESSA and where the superintendent sees the assessment system going in our state. But the bigger conversation that we're excited about having is kind of that elephant in the room and the high stakes attached to the assessment. So the accountability for schools and the grading of our schools and the evaluation systems for our teachers and the compensation all linked to one very high stakes test is probably the one area I'd like to focus on.
There's so many. Bottom line, we have to have an assessment. So we have to have an assessment. And an assessment that is too short, unfortunately, is sort of the ideal, but it doesn't produce reliable results. So you've got to weigh a reliable assessment if it's of a high stakes nature with what is too time consuming for children. So somewhere there's got to be a fine line. And on top of that, the idea of 3 multiple shorter assessments rolling up into one big score, which is one of the opportunities with the SSA, I think has to be studied carefully in that Park, for example, had looked at doing exactly that, and they dropped it. And I don't know the reasons why. I'm not a psychometrician. I wasn't following that closely. I just know they dropped it. And we have to be careful to make sure that whatever we do is psychometrically sound, provides us with reliable, valid results, especially if we're talking high-stakes nature. So.
Chad?
Well, I think the main thing that I'm focused on, I'm not a policymaker, I'm an educator, is purpose. What is the purpose of the assessment? And I think over the past 30 years where iStep has transitioned, I think it's transitioned in purpose. So I usually come from the purpose being to help students improve in education. But I think we have to be real careful in creating assessments that now are used for high-stakes decision-making, right? For accountability of schools, of districts, of teachers. I would echo what Cynthia said. We have to be very careful in validation, right? Tests are validated for certain purposes. Those purposes don't always go together. So I think the main thing before we start really these big, huge, important discussions is what is our purpose for ISTEP?
So I definitely want to come back to a few of those points, but first I wanted to start with you, Senator Miller. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the conversations that were happening during the legislative session that kind of led lawmakers to, propose and then ultimately support House Bill 1395 to get rid of ISTEP?
Well, we mentioned the implementation problems that we had, both with technology and there were 2 years in a row that just the internet-based method of having to every student across the state having to wait to go off to Kansas or whatever else, and that caused a lot of issues. There were times when booklets were sent to the wrong places, just a lot of things that didn't go well in the implementation. But it's not just that, it's just the whole concept of the high-stakes nature, which we talked about, that I had parents tell me that the kids are just under so much pressure, and that comes, I don't know if that's from well-intentioned sources or not, because when we first started doing ISTEP, you would have schools doing a pep rally to get the kids all pumped up, which was all meant to be a good thing, but when you looked at it more closely, it just caused angst and kids not to be able to sleep well, and really it's intended just to be a test. We want to know what the kids know and what they don't know so their teachers can help them. But somewhere along the way, either through the policy itself or how it was implemented, it just became bigger than what was intended. So.
Something I've heard over and over again in my reporting is that the key to a strong test is consistency, and that's certainly been a factor that we have been lacking in the state over the past few years. Do you think lawmakers bear any responsibility for kind of creating some of that instability?
It's true in terms of wanting to have consistent scores, that you have a baseline from which to measure. I guess I would just say, it's hard to get away from education being political because we spend billions and billions of dollars on it, right? But to the extent that you can set those aside, when we're fighting about governance or fighting about some of those other issues, that's fine. But when you're talking about something that shouldn't have anything to do with partisan politics, this is an area we should set those aside, and the test itself shouldn't be victim to that, but unfortunately it is because we have tied these other things to it with accountability and so forth.
So I want to go back to something Chad mentioned about the purpose of the test, and I kind of want to hear what all of you guys think about that. What is or what should be the goal of our next state test? What is it? What's the purpose of it? And Chad, maybe you want to start.
Well, I think the purpose should be to help students become better educated. Unfortunately, and I think we're in a tough situation where a lot of times legislators are blamed for the situation that we're in. But the reason we're in the situation that we're in is because we get a lot of money from Title I, right? And to be part of that program, and schools need that money. We use that money to help disadvantaged children. There are lots of constraints put on us by the federal government, and that's really why we have the accountability system that we have. I wouldn't put it solely on legislators. I wouldn't put it on educators. It's really just about the hoops we have to jump through to get the money. But I think if we're in this situation we're in now, where we have a chance to set up an assessment system that we want, we don't have the constraints that we used to have, I think the focus should be on quick assessments that get teachers results that they can use in the classroom. Really, no matter what we do, if we go to a long assessment, if teachers don't get those results quickly, there's no way they're going to use that in their classroom to help the student get better. And that's really what the assessment should be about. I don't know if we can really get away from an assessment system that judges teachers in schools because of the constraints we're under. But I think we should go that direction and try to remove some of the penalties associated with those assessments. Because I think if we generally think back, before No Child Left Behind, there wasn't this sentiment that I-STEP was this terrible test. I think people really didn't have a problem with it. I don't think people have a great problem with the assessment as it is now. There are people who complain about it being long. There are people that complain about the implementation. But I think the test itself, there's not really huge complaints about that. It's what we do with those results that make people feel uncomfortable and create all the tension, and then students feel it too. So I think getting back to using assessments to help students get better in education should be the focus.
Cynthia, do you want to weigh in?
All right, thinking about how do we shorten the shorten the testing time, shorten the time period to get results back quickly for teachers. Quite honestly, the only way to do it really quickly is purely online testing and no applied skills items where students have to write essays and such. And the problem moving away from essays and where students have to write out and show their work. And the reason, of course, that takes additional time is simply it takes humans to score. Once you have humans scoring, it takes more time. It just does. So if we move away from that, then we end up with a misalignment with our standards, and we're at risk with the review with ESSA, because we have to have assessments. One of the things they are requiring is that we have assessments well aligned to our standards. So it's two things. I don't know how to make them work together. I really don't. So you either have these applied skills items or you don't, or you have alignment. So it is a catch-22 that we're kind of in.
So to answer your original question, the purpose of the assessment, I want to answer that, and I want to respond a little bit if you don't mind. So I would say from the department's perspective and the superintendent's belief, and she's been talking about this since 2013, the assessment should provide teachers quick feedback on the students' level of learning and what they need to continue to grow towards college and career readiness. A secondary goal of it would be for parents to understand college and career readiness benchmarks for their students and also get quick and immediate feedback. So how do you do that and balance it with, as everybody really has said, an assessment that is not overly long, an assessment that meets the federal flexibility requirements, but some of the things Cynthia just mentioned, I would say through the assessment committee, which we're very excited to be a part of, the superintendent is, I do think there's some unique nuances, and I do think we should not limit ourselves to our thinking. So for example, there's some state examples where the open-endedness, because Cynthia's right, we do want to continue to measure our students' ability to these higher order thinking skills, and the only way to do that in many cases is through open-ended. But some states are looking at a model where let's go to kind of the shorter assessment approach, that within that shorter assessment approach, let's say there's 2 open-ended math assessment questions. One could be for the teacher to score and get immediate understanding about that student's knowledge. One could potentially be scored for the actual assessment components for accountability. Another one is teachers do get to score, but then they're also sent off to a testing vendor for validation scores. But I, as the classroom teacher, now suddenly understand, oh, this is where my class is performing on this standard, but the actual score results come on the back end. So I do think we need to be really open to some unique opportunities that ESSA and 1395 are going to provide us around this conversation to do both the purpose that I think we all want our assessments to ultimately get to, and fulfilling all the requirements to not put federal funding in jeopardy.
You are more the experts than I am, but in terms of what the value is to the teacher, is a summative test really that much valuable to them, or is it more the formative? And so because of the federal rules, we have to have a summative test. We have to be able to say how many kids are getting over the bar. So at least in terms of what the current version of iStep and whatever we're going to be required to replace it is. I see the value there more for parents to know, okay, whatever grades my kid might be getting, is there grade inflation there? But I know if there's a standard test that everyone is taking, where we stand on that. There's been some folks floating, well, why don't we just let it's home rule state, why don't we just have half a dozen tests and let districts pick which one they want to give? The problem there is then you don't have that set standard, so parents don't know. And then the other thing I throw out there is just the data for policymakers and folks to analyze. We originally had testing a generation ago because of the achievement gap, and we wanted to shrink that. So the value there is having a common test that we can look at with the disaggregated data and see what's working, what's not, and I guess the move here is, can we make it as short as possible and make it as less cumbersome as possible and less high stakes as possible?
One thing I would add, though, hope the microphone's getting this, is I think another really important thing is to remove sort of the secrecy of the test, right? If at all possible, and I know when we give assessments, we tend not to release items so that we can reuse them over and over again. But if we really are ever going to get to the point where we want it to be based on students improving educationally, I think we have to release those questions so the teacher can go over it with the student, so they can justify this question identifies this standard and this student needs additional work on it. I think if we continue to have tests where we don't release the questions, teachers will always say, well, I don't really know if that even addresses the standard. And there's this trust factor that I feel like right now isn't there. I don't feel like teachers have a great deal of trust in the assessments. So I think anything we could do to improve transparency would pull teachers back into supporting those assessments that we give.
So kind of going back to some of the things that Danielle and Cynthia were mentioning about ESSA. So that's the new Every Student Succeeds Act that will technically replace the No Child Left Behind Act as our federal education policy come summer. So could you talk a little bit about, you both kind of alluded to this, but just, we already know that there are some things that aren't going to change, and there are some restrictions in place. I don't know, whoever wants to kind of address it first.
I want to jump in first, more to get back to get back to what Chad was just saying. The release of items, right now with the iStep, granted it's gone away, but this iStep statute requires the release of items. Of course, last year we weren't able to because of the shortening of the test and we had to reuse these items that were just being piloted, and we had to, otherwise the test would have been twice as long last year, spring of 15. But the iStep statute requires the release of all applied skills items. It has since iStep Plus came around in '96 legislation, or I think. So that is required. And it's the applied skills items that are the most useful to teachers because they get to see how the students actually worked out the problems and what essays they wrote, the mistakes they worked, or the mistakes students made in general on the math items and such. And studying those, you're right, that is where absolutely most use comes from. Releasing some multiple choice items, honestly, 10% of the multiple choice items have had to change each year anyway. Releasing them, I don't see why that would have been a big deal, with the exception, once an item is released, it can't be reused, and the biggest cost in assessment is piloting. Item creation is the biggest cost, or one of the biggest costs. So the more you release, the more you have to develop, and we have to keep the cost in mind also. Back to your question.
Well, we're definitely going to come back to cost, so keep your comments. But let's just let everybody know, what are the things that we know can't change or won't change for now?
Again, the large-scale assessment, one summative, or across 3 smaller summative assessments. But we have to have a summative assessment that has to be used in accountability, that has to be used for essentially grading our schools. Not everybody uses an A through F system like Indiana does, but to evaluate our schools. And so that cannot change. We have to have that or we forego Title I funds, as Chad indicated.
Danielle?
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, I think what you're asking is, for the general public, what has to stay the same?
Yeah.
So under the new federal legislation, we still have to test our students in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. We have to test them on English language arts and mathematics. We have to test them on science once in middle school and once in high school. We have to test our students aligned on assessments to our state standards. So the idea of buying off-the-shelf assessments, the options of ACT and SAT, and some of the other components would have to be vetted against our state standards, or maybe even customized to match Indiana state standards. So those are some of the parameters. Some additional parameters include that it does have to be used in your accountability system. But some of the accountability flexibilities under the new legislation and federal legislation allow for other multiple measures to be added. So therefore, creating a balance to that state summative score. And I want to come back to that word real quick, score, because I think both of my colleagues here have said summative test, and I think there is a nuance. I think this is a difference. It asks for a summative score. That doesn't have to mean it's on one summative assessment. So both have mentioned this idea of 3, and nobody has ever said there's a magic number of 3 small incremental assessments, but the federal legislation, it does allow for language for it to be small incremental assessments. 3 is the number both have used. There's nothing about 3. But then how could you get a summative score over multiple assessments is also a possibility. So those are things within the federal legislation we're excited about. Also the computer adaptability, which that means a student who may be having to have a summative score based upon their knowledge of their take a fourth grade set of standards, also will give teacher feedback above and below, because what computer adaptive allows for is for, I'm going to use, if you don't mind, he's brilliant. He's testing well off fourth grade standards. His teacher needs to know, wow, so, little Pete here, he can read at 8th grade. So you get that kind of information along with a summative result that shows that Pete is also mastering 4th grade college and career readiness. So I think those for us are some of the really exciting components that the federal legislation will allow for the conversation in Indiana to be around.
So for those of you who don't spend all their time writing about tests like I do and talking about tests like these folks do, summative tests are tests that kind of take one snapshot in time, right? That's how iStep has pretty much been. And formative tests for teachers, you're all familiar, are those ones that kind of can diagnose you throughout the year and see where you're at. So they're kind of 2 big schools of thoughts around tests, and there are even other kinds, but the one that iStep is and what our new state test would have to be, based on what Cynthia and Danielle and Chad have said, is a summative test. So that one score, however it's divvied up perhaps, and that one kind of snapshot in time.
Point on that. We all agree formative tests are what teachers need to know what their kids do and do not know. One slight problem, if we wanted to use 3 formative tests as our summative score, then you're saying, all right, you got to know this by this point in the year, you got to know this by this point in the year, and pretty soon you've developed a state curriculum, which we all say we don't want to do.
Actually, so in talking with some other states and some other chiefs from around the country, they've started working with assessment psychometricians and so forth that have developed systems that don't actually create that, because that's not something we would agree to either. We do not want a state curriculum or every 9 weeks you have to be teaching this in lockstep, because another thing that we at the department would be pretty excited to see is more of an idea of locally driven timelines. So getting away from testing windows, and rather, if you're on a balanced calendar, that you do your first formative /summative approach within the first 3 weeks of your school calendar. So allowing for you to get the information when you need it on your students. So actually, we do think there are solutions, and that's when I say 1395 is exciting. And I guess I would hope again that we really open ourselves to so many ways of looking at this and not making any assumptions around what we have to do.
So that's actually,
Just add one other thing, though. Part of the legislation does say that we can use portfolios, projects, and performance tasks. So that's an option. Not that I endorse that, but just putting that out there.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Chad, but I think that's an option only under the innovation pilot of ESSA. It's not, so the federal, again, federal ESSA, the Student Succeeds Act, allows for states who choose to apply, and there may be up to 7 states or a group of states as one group who would apply for an innovation pilot. And there's a lot left to be learned about that innovation pilot, but what Chad's speaking of would be something that, if a state so chose, could kind of look down that path of portfolios and other options. In the situation Indiana is in with 1395 and driving a new state assessment, we're unique. You know, many states are getting ESSA provided to them without a 1395 opportunity at the same time. So an innovative pilot for them may be a better timing than it seems like it would be for Indiana.
To speak to the multiple formative assessments, one thing we must keep in mind, again, if we want to roll that up to a summative, the minute you start putting high stakes on formative assessments, they lose some of their oomph, and suddenly test security becomes a big issue, because any summative assessment has to be kept highly secure. And so we don't want, especially if kids are seeing the same items over here as they're seeing over there, as they're seeing over there at different times throughout the year, your security suddenly gets blown. So that is something that would have to be carefully monitored. We already know that we have to watch Twitter and Facebook for items appearing. And a few years ago, an I-STEP writing prompt got posted on Facebook, and suddenly 8th grade writing prompt was thrown out, and it affected the whole state. So test security has to be kept in check on anything that we go, any path we go down, and we have to keep that in mind.
So this using of the formative assessments, that's something that teachers also ask me about, and they've been talking about it on our Facebook page, and when I go meet with them, you know, there are some formative tests, and one example that is used in Indiana is the NWEA test, and I get asked a lot, well, why can't we just use that? Like, we like that, or that's helpful to us. You know, some teachers say, why can't we? Or what are the challenges about trying to adapt something like that, if it can be adapted?
We actually do use NWEA in our district, and we do use it for teacher evaluation. The thing that I would want there to be a lot of discussion around is teaching standards. So in Indiana, we teach standards based on grade levels. When you move to a computer adaptive test, students will go up and down based on their performance. So a natural response from teachers will be, well, I teach on grade level A. If my student starts out the year on grade level F, should I switch up which standards I'm teaching to that student? And then there becomes that whole conversation on what is the structure of the curriculum. So while we do generally like NWEA and it's very useful to us, I think that's a very challenging question that would need to be studied in depth.
One of the big challenges also with NWEA and the growth piece, I've heard wonderful, wonderful things about it. I've not really, it was being used in my prior position only for the first year I was there, and we moved away from it. So I'm not real familiar with exactly the reporting, but I've heard very good things about it. But one of the big challenges is as Chad was saying, on the grade level and with the standards. And if a student, you may have grown a child who is 3 years behind, and maybe you grew the child 2 years, but they're still below grade level, and that's still going to count as not passing, because the ESSA is requiring that we have an assessment on grade level that assesses our grade level standards. And NWEA doesn't limit it to that. So quite honestly, right now, NWEA doesn't even meet the federal requirements, and they've apparently, they know this. But again, besides the grade level issue, they don't incorporate applied skills items. So we would have to add to it. We would have to add items, which would be development, which would also raise the security issue. Big challenge, big challenge.
Danielle, is there anything you wanted to add?
Just that I believe that the NWEA company has recently announced that they very closely and in fact were instrumental in parts of what happened under ESSA, and they actually do feel like they have a state solution that would speak to all the concerns just mentioned here. You know, obviously they've been using a lot of scientific research to make sure that they are thinking of all the things that were just mentioned as potential pitfalls. So I'm excited, you know, to look at the formative approach and what various vendors, through likely a very likely state RFP, will bring to us as solutions. Because we do know there's a lot to be gained from some of the formative approaches to assessment.
And then I wanted to follow up to your comments about, you know, the summative score, and if we break up the test, perhaps that's one option. Do you worry that that's going to just kind of increase the testing, I don't know, the atmosphere? Is that just going to bring about more testing when we hear a lot that there's already too much?
Again, if designed in the right way, that those, ideally were a few items a part of a larger body of formative items. So, let's say there's 20 right now on a formative approach with, let's say, acuity, because that's been used in Indiana. And in that, there are certain items for which the students and the teachers may or may not be fully aware which ones are accounting for the summative score at the end. I think it could potentially not be much longer. What would make it slightly potentially longer is the adaptability. So again, if you're measuring a student on their abilities and it's taking students down a couple test items in difficulty and up, there may be a few more test items per child until they find that niche of where their performance or their proficiency level is. But again, I think these are all things that we would like to see what the solutions exist to answer your question.
I want to jump in again. One other concern I have with any computer adaptive test, and online testing I know is the wave of the future in computer adaptive, but we still have, besides the technology requirements and issues that this state faces, we still have students who, due to their disabilities or whatever, require paper pencil. So we need an assessment also that can meet their needs, because we can't just suddenly decide not to test them. That's not allowed through the SSA either. So, and once you turn a computer adaptive test into a paper pencil version, which NWEA MAP can be given paper pencil, you have suddenly upped the testing time considerably for your most needy students, is my fear.
I think testing's kind of taken a bad rap here, and understandably so, because of all the problems that we've had. But remember, I mean, there are just tests in life that kids need to be prepared to take. I think the issue is where the high stakes nature, which you mentioned lots of times, but also spending so much time of the year preparing for the test. This should just be second nature. That if these truly are aligned to standards, it should be going right along with teaching anyway. And can we get away from kids thinking, well, your entire future is dependent upon this, or your school's going to get docked, or your teacher's going to get docked, depending on how. We've got to get away from that. Let's have, as I say, let's follow the federal law to the extent we can. But I think another problem we've gotten into is that we're using different tools to try and accomplish things that they weren't designed to do. So we're trying to see, well, can we turn this formative test into a summative thing? I'm not sure NWA was designed to do that. NWA is very valuable for its purpose, but you mentioned, so we get to cost later. Obviously, those things cost more if we're going to do more of those. But as long as they're kept small scale and low stakes, it is helpful for parents and teachers and students to have that information. And as long as it's not creating fear in the kids for how they're going to do, we just want to know what they know and what they don't know.
I do want to interject. I think the thing that doesn't get realized for people who don't participate in assessments is that the administration of assessments is a very encompassing job that takes a lot of time and effort. And we have gotten in the trend through no one specific person's fault, but we are switching tests all the time. And when we switch to a new test, that new test has a new test administration. And not just the test coordinators, all the teachers have to get used to that assessment, which creates all kinds of fear and angst. And so I think while these ideas are very big and very important, that always has to be considered. So it really does scare me. While I'm a huge supporter of computer adaptive tests, the more administrations we have frightens me, because I know whenever we have administrations, there are always glitches, right? I mean, in Indiana, it's not unique to that. You can go on the internet and read articles about any test in any state, and there are always glitches. Computers break down, fiber cables get cut, accommodations in and of themselves are a huge deal. When you try to go to a computer-based assessment and have a program read to a student, there are always issues with that. And the solutions aren't easy, simple solutions, and it requires people to go through all kinds of steps. So I would, if it were up to me, I would limit the number of test administrations to one. Just do one, get your result, and be done with it. Make the test as simple as possible, not in terms of ease for the student, but in terms of structure. Build on that once we get that right, because we have been struggling just to get test administration in Indiana right for a long time, and I think that's where most of the fear and anger, people being upset, really comes from.
Chad makes an excellent point there. Indiana has switched vendors one other time. The grad exam, we're going back to the idea of a 10th grade grad exam. Well, before the ECAs as the grad exam, prior to that, it was a 10th grade GQE. And there was 1 or 2 years there where we switched from CTB to a different vendor. And one of the requirements in that shift was the new vendor had to do it exactly like the schools were used to seeing. Exactly. All the manuals, everything. So it was as blind to the schools that it was a new vendor as possible. So it was easy and smooth for the schools to just get it in, get it out, and get on with their lives, and not suddenly have to learn a whole new system, anywhere from the administration, the way the books are laid out, to packing the tests. All of that, Chad is exactly right. The whole administration piece is huge, and the time it takes in the schools at the district level with multiple schools, I did it in IPS for many years, but then at the school level, the personnel it takes, and they don't have anybody hired full-time just to do that, so it's pulling a teacher, multiple teachers, administrators away from their other job just to pull off the test. Making that as smooth and seamless as possible is a major necessity.
I just want to point out, to me, it's interesting, and I'm wondering if the audience is picking up on the obviousness of what I'm hearing in all these comments. We're concerned about test security. We're overburdened by how much time it takes to administer it. We have people who are fretting and staying up all night and they're sick. If we did away with what Indiana has created in this monster of aligning it to the way we grade our teachers, the way we compensate our teachers, the way we grade our schools, all this would fall back and not be what it has become. And we could get back to what the purpose of assessment is supposed to be, which is giving teachers information and parents information about what their child knows, what their child does not know, and what they need to be college and career ready. So I think really we can talk about 100 different ways of assessing, but until our state leaders are willing to step up and say, okay, enough is enough. Stop grading our teachers in our schools on these assessments. We're going to continue to perpetuate everything everybody's just said. And that's the concern I have.
So I would agree with that, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That clearly achievement on academic performance is something that's important in what teachers are there for. But I would also say a principal doesn't need a test from the state to know how their teachers are performing. We could probably walk into a classroom and know who an effective educator is or not. So instead of tying their hands and saying this is the end-all be-all, allow them to come up with those other things that are part of that evaluation, and that goes for the student, the teacher, and the school system as well.
The superintendent has long said she's for accountability, but she's for fair and equitable accountability. And what we've created is a system where it is really about one test and one administration of one test that's been plagued and burdened with all these things that everybody's mentioned. So again, we are for strong accountability, but we think there's ways to do that with an accountability system that does measure school improvement. And school improvement for your school and versus Chad's school are all different. And we have those indicators through school improvement plans. You know, we have lots of ways in which we can measure school success. So we'd like to definitely see the shift be towards that. And the ESSA is not going to allow for us to do away with completely including assessment results. And to your point, we wouldn't want to completely do away with it. But the overemphasis on the high stakes has become what's making all of us so sick about assessments in our state.
So ESSA is the perfect opportunity for us to say, what are those other performance measures, in addition to how many are getting over the bar? What about growth? What about English proficiency? What about grad rates? Those are all things that we should have a part of the calculation.
So Senator, I'm going to pick on you a little bit since you're our representative from the legislature. You know, it sounds like there's definitely some agreement here, but how likely is it, do you think, based on, you know, what we've seen this year already about relaxing rules for accountability, is it likely, do you think, that your colleagues in the legislature would be in favor of rolling back some of these accountability measures tied to exams?
Well, like I said, it's not a matter of rolling them back. It's a matter of finding additional things to be measured on. And just as when we send report cards home with kids, we don't just give them one letter grade like we do for schools now. Why can't we have a series of things that we're graded on to give more information instead of just having this one solitary thing? I think that's where we can find some agreement on. We're not going to get away completely from not having testing. But ESSA does allow some additional metrics to be added in, and this is the time that I'd like to not just have that 23-member panel talking about testing itself, but talk about how that fits in with what are the appropriate measures of success that we want to monitor.
That's a good segue. I know I've talked with Cynthia a lot over the last couple months about Indiana's new accountability system that they'll be using to calculate grades for the first time in 2016. I'm sure you guys maybe have heard about it. But I know that we've talked a lot about what those additional measures might look like. And if you haven't had time to jump into the whole system and how it's all calculated, I wrote about it. But Cynthia, could you tell us a little bit about how is the state already moving toward that, and what work is left to do with those extra not test score based items?
So in our current model, we are already breaking it out by 3 domains. For grades 3 through 8, we're breaking it through a performance grade and a growth grade, and then it rolls up into an overall grade, or GPA, but an overall grade. And then for high schools, it will include performance, growth, and multiple measures. Multiple measures being college career readiness things, how well students do on IB, AP, dual credit, industry certifications, and graduation rate. And so where the multiple measures piece for the high schools, we believe is covered. It even meets the criteria set through ESSA. But for grades 3 through 8, we need to add another multiple measures. And we're very curious where we will land. And I don't know if it will come out of the assessment committee or not. Probably not. We need to bring back an accountability group to think about this further. But some of the options already being proposed through ESSA, such as surveys and such, it's how do you standardize it, and how do you do it? You can't, some of this stuff you can't even turn into a teacher. It's school-wide, and we've tossed around lots of ideas. When the new accountability model was being developed, they wanted something in the 3 through 8 area. They talked about attendance. Attendance used to be a part of the old AYP accountability model, but it was left off because it can be fudged too easy, unfortunately. So they tossed around lots of ideas to throw in there. iRead they thought about using, but iRead is yet again another assessment, and it aligns with your English language arts score. Not exactly, but it's another assessment. You want something beyond assessment. We know ESSA is going to require adding in a language minority assessment score, so we know we can factor that in, but that again doesn't get to our multiple measures. So adding in one other piece to assess grades 3 through 8 it's going to be a challenge. And how do we get something standardized? And we've had lots of conversations, but we're not there yet.
And that is part of, this new state panel that's going to be looking at a new state test. It's also technically, I think in the legislation, it says it's a testing and accountability panel. So these are all kinds of questions and things that will at least be brought up over the next few months. And that panel is required to report back to the legislature by December 1st.
Do you mind if I add a little bit
No,
to
go
that
ahead.
too? Because, I mean, again, I mentioned we're really excited about that multiple measures conversation, and Cynthia's right in that there is the component of our second language learners have to be measured through an assessment. And I wanted to add, just so as we're talking about assessments, that doesn't mean anything new. We already do have a WIDA assessment that measures language acquisition of our second language learners, so that information is already available to us at the state level. So no new assessment has to be put in place. So then we look at, well, what other multiple measures? And the other thing that we're understanding around the regulations is it has to be disaggregatable among all subgroups statewide.
So what does that mean,
Absolutely.
disaggregatable?
So what that means is, so for example, survey, Cynthia mentioned, how do you create a survey that is valid, and how do you get results on something like a survey type tool? So you have to think about disaggregatable means by subgroup. So what does this mean for our free and reduced lunch population? So let's just take attendance. You can disaggregate that by various subgroups. So anything that we do choose from multiple measures has to be disaggregated by subgroup. Special education, free and reduced lunch, urban, rural, suburban, ethnic minority groups, and so forth. So that's another nuance of the accountability multiple measures. And I started mentioning a little bit ago, we would certainly in the panel, the accountability panel that existed previously, did discuss how can you use school improvement plans. So I think we would be really excited to bring back that conversation around each school's individual school improvement plan. And while they may vary, and your school indicators might be around school safety and yours might be about parent involvement, could there be some kind of metric put to each of their schools' growth towards their goal, and then that have a number that could be disaggregatable? Meaning, so we think there's a lot of potential in that space, and especially when you offset that and try to offset that to a greater level of importance than some of the assessment pieces within that.
So I want to circle back to, we've been kind of alluding to it, I want to get back to cost. So this, there's the potential for a lot of work here, and we've seen, a couple big testing contracts come through in the last few years. What is this going to look like? Because are we going to have to go back to the legislature to ask for money? What do we not have to redo? I mean, cost-wise, what is the state looking at? Whoever wants to chime in first.
I want to know what the dollar value of that would be, but some of the issues are if we're going to try to get something off the shelf, it's not going to be aligned to our standards because our standards are unique. So there will be a cost to having to have that additional piece.
To customize anything off the shelf would require additional cost. Not only in the customization side means anywhere from the artwork and what the booklet looks like or the online looks like to item development. Now, luckily, yes, with iStep, we do own our items. So we do have somewhat of an item bank that we can move forward with. And that, depending on how many, because our items align to our stuff. So depending on how many we incorporate, quite honestly, that could almost be the best of both worlds. If you incorporate enough of them, it may allow for a smoothing and equating back to the current test, which means and for example, when we moved from fall testing in fall of 2008 to spring testing in spring 2009, they were able to use many of the same items and equate back the scores. Now, they had to do a new standard setting and start. It did become a baseline year again and a start over. But for that first year of testing, they weren't sort of blind scores. They were able to equate back to the fall of 2008 and get some useful information out of that. So if we're able to incorporate items that we already own, items that have already been piloted into whatever new assessment system, that could, in theory, help offset some of the cost. Again, going back to my earlier statement, item development is your most expensive piece.
I'd like to add something to that, and I think it's very important. When we have a state assessment like iStep, the way a lot of those questions come about is because we do pilot questions for our students. I'm sure if people read Chalkbeat, they've read about the issues that have been presented with Book 2 this year. I would prefer, and I know our teachers would too, to not have our students pilot test questions that don't really have an impact on them. I understand that we use them, and that's the reason that we pilot them. But I think teachers, parents, students feel like that's an additional unnecessary testing that hopefully, when we do transition, we could find a remedy for that.
We are looking to incorporate, we've got a technical advisory committee that is reviewing the different assessments, the technical, the psychometric side of it. We are having discussions on how to embed future pilot items so it isn't a separate test booklet, as you say. The issues with that is the minute you start embedding, the testing time becomes longer. On the other hand, now you're giving it to everybody in the state so that everybody in the state takes a longer versus a sample of students. But maybe we could have fewer items so it's a minimal longer. But it still goes back to if we continue to have applied skills items, you can't embed an extra writing prompt without somebody noticing you've got an extra writing prompt, you know? And that giving a student 2 writing prompts, it's not that easy.
I want to get to the funding question too, because I think there's a lot of opportunity not spoken about yet, which is if in this redesign of our state assessment system, we can do away with AccuPlacer, which is an 11th grade college and career ready exam, which much of the information in that exam could potentially be provided for in the 10th grade exam for which is required. The other thing that potentially could fall away would be the iRead 3 exam. If our assessment is designed to measure our full battery of English language arts / reading standards, why are we then also having a cost and an additional testing burden of iRead 3? So we see this idea of cost incorporating not only the fact that we own our test items, and that might put Indiana in a good situation, but what could we also reduce completely away from our students and our schools and further reduce our testing assessment budget?
Regarding iRead 3, though, one of the reasons it's not currently incorporated is the fact that we've got to quickly give the assessment. It's a straight multiple choice. It has no applied skills. It's a straight, short, roughly an hour and a half assessment that kids take. But it's designed to quickly get results back so that remediation can occur before the end of the school year so that students have an opportunity for a retest in the summer. But there are stakes associated with iRead.
If you're a teacher,
if the
do you need an
stakes
iRead 3 to know if your kids are reading?
if the stakes go away, then there's no reason for it. But as long as there are stakes, we must have a separate assessment that allows for us to get quick results back so that we can do that remediation before the retest. It's too much of a high stakes for grade 3. Again, the only way to get around that, stakes go away, no problem. Stakes there, we got to have it.
Can I just throw a question out? Could we meet our federal requirements by having an objective test only and just make it as short as possible? That way we get the results back quicker, which has always been a complaint, would be cheaper. Because I personally would rather invest the money in doing formative tests or doing remediation, whatever else, instead of having a larger summative test.
It's again back to the alignment piece with the applied skills portion. Danielle mentioned Chad mentioned performance tasks, portfolios. There are other ways we could meet that applied skills nature of our standards, but what additional time does it take to score those? And again, that becomes this other grant piece that we would have to win. Exploring ways to meet our standards, the full extent of our standards more quickly, I think is a good thing to delve into. Right now, I don't know beyond applied skills, though. I don't know how else to assess writing without asking a student to write an essay, a short essay. And that is one of our standards. And we are being required to assess the full extent of our standards as best we can. Even listening and speaking, that we don't currently assess, for us to get around that, because how do you assess listening and speaking? It takes a waiver from the federal government, which we hope we get granted. But writing, I don't believe we get away with not assessing writing.
And then I just want to circle back, I think we're getting ready fairly soon to take audience questions, but I wanted to end with Chad. So, during these transitions, and we've had a lot of them, I imagine you see a lot of day-to-day what this looks like for teachers and students and parents and school leaders. What do what kinds of things what kind of, guidance or wisdom can you offer them, or are you thinking about now heading into this next transition, to kind of help ease the uncertainty or the instability?
So This is a tricky question. In our district, because of all of the different issues we've experienced with ISTEP, we really have moved away from using that as one of our indicators. So we do what are called quality assurance reviews, where we bring in our principals 3 times a year and sit down with them, talk about the key indicators and how we're going to improve education in each of our buildings. But we have had to have that very difficult discussion of, do we include ISTEP anymore? Because it's always changing, right? There was this realignment last year where we switched to college and career readiness standards and cut scores were changed. Well, when that happens, we can't really make an accurate comparison from one year to the next. So we do rely on NWEA much more so than we do ISTEP, and I think that's unfortunate because we do spend so much money on this assessment that's supposed to help students get better. So, like I said in the beginning, I think we have to develop an assessment that addresses the needs of students and get away from all the accountability stuff, but I know that's a challenging thing. And like Cynthia and I talked about earlier, test administration has become such an overwhelming job that I just wish outside people could see what that's like, because during this past test administration, the switch to Pearson, that was supposed to be an improvement over using CTB. I would say on an average day, we made at least 100 calls to Pearson throughout the district. I mean, there's nothing that ever goes as you would expect to. There's always things that pop up, and that requires tons of time. So just getting that test administration thing down would really help out districts, I think.
I'll open it up if there's anything else regarding, feedback from teachers or guidance or what you hope teachers and parents and other members of the public know as we head into this kind of new uncharted territory.
One other thing that just popped into my mind that I think is very important that we had to deal with this year, and it continues to be a huge issue across the nation, is opting out, right? So as part of ESSA, we are required as a district under accountability to have 95% participation. But students really aren't required to participate in ISTEP. And so we have put districts and principals and parents in this very difficult position where they're trying to make a decision that's best for their children. And some of them generally have concerns about assessment and don't want their child to participate. As a district, we have to urge them to participate because of that 95% requirement. And so I think that law has put us all in this very challenging position because there's no real recourse for us. We can't force a student to participate, but we want them to. And so that's a great challenge that I think is often left unaddressed as well.
Random thought we didn't talk about.
Sure.
And that is the timing of the test. Because we do this before the year is over, then the vendor is hiring whoever to grade those things. What if we gave the test at the end of the year? What if we just waited, and then you would have teachers who are available in the summer to grade those writing prompts?
Right now, the setup, the timing of the test is designed with the applied skills portion being given as early as it is, so that the applied skills items can be scored in time to be added into the multiple choice portion and results be returned by the end of May, the goal being by the end of May. Now, there are a lot of schools in Indiana on the balanced calendar where that means before the end of the school year, not much before, but before. But there are still schools in the state that are getting out more mid-May, so it's after the fact. I know that, again, with the applied skills portion, you have to have that built-in extra time. Without the applied skills portion, turning around the results shouldn't be more than 2-3 weeks after you shut down the close of the testing window. When it's paper, you've got to factor in some of that logistics. But
I understand why it's done, but I'm just pointing out that we could expand the pool of who's grading these tests and increase the evaluation of it.
Results coming back, and I mean, honestly, getting them by the end of summer is not ideal, but at least you have the summer to do something with. If you wait and not score them till summer, then you're getting them back by the beginning of the school year, going to teachers who are suddenly seeing results of kids that they've never seen before, which you sort of have that, but not as bad when you're at least getting it at the beginning of the summer. They can go back, look at what they did, plan during the summer, and teachers do work through the summer. I don't like this idea that teachers don't work in the summer. I know better. I taught. I know better. They can use those results to plan for the next year. So getting them back right at the beginning of the school year, they'd have no time to do anything with them.
So now we're going to move on to some reader questions. I appreciate we've got a lot of questions, which I'm really happy about. So I'm going to say, just so we can try to get to as many as possible, if you have a really compelling answer, please offer it. If you have a less compelling answer, maybe we'll save it for another question, just because I want to be able to address as many of your questions as possible. So the first one, where does art, music, science fairs, field trips, theater programs, human interactions, and respectfulness fit when you only measure reading and math? In sum, do reading and math create a complete education? And so obviously we're referring to reading and math are the two main tested subjects.
One thing I will say is this, reading and math, especially at the elementary level, I think once you start hitting middle school, it gets more difficult. But reading and math are the basics of many of those things. You can't do music without mathematics. Students who are able to read music have a more conceptual understanding of mathematics, of fractions, of ratio and proportion. Why they are making them separate is beyond me. There should be more integration is what I would argue. You should be reading about the art, looking at famous painters and such, and reading. What do you know? There's reading. And it gets beyond, and reading about different countries and such. Keeping reading as a separate thing, language arts is a separate thing, mathematics is a separate thing. Oh, good grief, integrate people. That's teaching. And again, it's easier, I would argue, at the elementary, high school algebra closed the door, that's what I taught, and I was not good at integrating. But my own kids have had some excellent teachers who did some wonderful integration at the elementary level, and it just thrilled me.
So our next question, how does testing lead to a complete education for the 21st century? That's easy, right? Easy answer.
Simple question. I think it doesn't. I think it leaves a lot to be desired. To go back to that last question, I do think what gets measured gets taught, right? So we grade schools on English and math, so that's what the focus has become, and that's definitely unfortunate, but that is the reality of our system.
Have to be the reality of our accountability system. So back to that kind of the arts and the other components, if you think about what a school focuses on, they do focus on opportunities for students and varied opportunities and access to and positive school-wide behavior components to kind of get at that respect and character education. All those things exist in our schools, and so that can exist in our way in which we grade our school success. Can it potentially be measured on every assessment? Maybe not, maybe yes. Nonfiction is a focus on our assessments. Many of those nonfiction passages are around other subject areas, and then the students have to have higher order thinking skills to integrate the two. So it does exist somewhat in assessment, but I say the real opportunity is in our accountability design in that multiple measure space to get at how we really value those other components of our education system.
Next question, has testing actually shrunk the achievement gap?
The testing is just a measurement, right? So in terms of what's happened with the achievement gap, we'd have to go back and look at the data, but the education for every student in the state, that's where the focus is. The testing itself is not in itself what drives the improvement. So that would be mine.
And I'll maybe take a little bit of liberty to interpret the question. Has maybe the emphasis on testing shrunk the achievement gap at the expense of other components of, school instruction or class time?
I think that's really why people generally see No Child Left Behind as a failure, is because it didn't have the intended consequences. So I would say that no, we really haven't shrank the achievement gap. Maybe in certain areas, maybe a little bit, but overall, not really. I think that's the failure of No Child Left Behind.
The only thing I will comment on, and not that I believe it has done what it was intended, but before No Child Left Behind, ISTEP results did not come back disaggregated by race, ethnicity, free and reduced lunch, or any of that. They didn't. We didn't. If you wanted it disaggregated, you had to do it locally. The state did not provide that data. And No Child Left Behind required a disaggregation of data, which I think has been ultimately a good thing. How that data is used and any growth that's come out of that, I cannot speak to that. But it not suddenly being hidden in a black box is a very good thing.
This is a pretty specific one. As a parent of a current third grade student, we have not received iRead results and 3 weeks are left in the school year. That doesn't give teachers time to remediate children. How can we change this? And we talked a little bit about this, but whoever has the most succinct answer.
I would say that actually schools have received their individual student results, and schools have permission to share with parents, I believe several weeks ago, their individual students' iRead results. So if you're a parent in the audience who has not received your results, I would contact your school tomorrow. They do have that information. It is not embargoed to talk to a parent, and the reason we do release that several weeks ago is so they can plan for summer remediation opportunities. So I would encourage you to reach out to your school right away.
We're zipping right through these. These are great. So the next question. The senator said, does a principal really need a test to know which teachers are performing? To follow, do teachers really need a state test to know how kids are doing?
I would say we believe that there's so many ways that teachers informally measure their students in their classrooms. Every single day, a teacher is adjusting their curriculum and their instruction to meet the needs of their students. Taught 4th and 5th grade for a really long time, and I was a principal for a really long time. So I do believe that teachers have every single thing they need to adjust their instruction for their students without an ISTEP test.
And this is some more specifications. This is actually, I'm glad someone's asking about accommodations. What consideration is given to testing times for students with accommodations? For example, extra time for English language learners. And then they go on to say, for example, a 1.5-hour test becomes 3 hours. Is this taken into consideration when deciding on standardized times?
The rule of thumb is typically time and a half for language minority students, not double time. But it does, each decision on children regarding if they've got an ILP, which is a language minority plan, or an IEP, an individualized education plan, is supposed to be specific to the child's needs. And should that be taken into account? Absolutely, it should be. Any one subtest is not an hour and a half to begin with. Might be multiple subtests that add up to an hour and a half, but any one subtest might be 20, 30 minutes. So is 40 minutes too long? I can't speak to that. It has to be an individual decision based on the child. And the educator, the school does have the ability to spread it out where the child is not taking the whole test in one sitting, okay? All subtests in one sitting. They could spread that out based on the needs of the child.
But it is a good point, and I think it often gets overlooked. So when you are in a district or a school that has high populations of special ed students or E&L students, they do require more time due to their accommodations. When you add that time on to large groups of students, you're effectively taking instructional time away from them. So our most challenging students are essentially getting less instruction because of their accommodations. And while that's a requirement of their IEP, ILP, 504, that's, I don't think, where we would want it to be, right? And so that always is a big consideration in our district. We have to plan above and beyond to take accommodations into consideration. So anything we could do to try to alleviate those issues for special needs students, I would definitely endorse.
Kind of, actually, this question builds on that. They're asking specifically, how will you look at appropriate accommodations for English language learners? And I'm going to assume that's in reference to what a new state test might be. For example, different accommodations per proficiency level, picture support, built-in native, built-in native language dictionary, etc.
I think a lot of that will come out of what the new federal legislation will allow for. The new federal legislation does have a very strong emphasis on second language learning, which I don't think existed as strongly in the previous law. So that will be an interesting conversation as they go through negotiated rulemaking, because those details in that question I don't believe are a part of what we understand yet at the state level. I can say we do know that that remains the same for the first year in the United States, in the English language. They do not have to be assessed in English language arts, but I'm sure who's asking that question are wondering what happens beyond that first year. We all know that suddenly after 1 year you are not proficient in English. So therefore, what can be provided beyond that would be a very interesting question, and I'm sure we're open to a lot of guidance on what that can be. I also think too, this WIDA exam being included in accountability will allow for us to have a conversation about what are our second language learners able to do, and maybe move that emphasis away from the I-STEP component for our second language learners, but rather the WIDA, which showcases their individual language acquisition. That is measuring how are they gaining that second language, whether that second language might be Spanish or that second language might be English. So I think that will be another nuance that might help balance the conversation about what our second language learners are able to gain from our education system.
That actually kind of reminded me, I wanted to ask too, we think about I-STEP as being one specific test, but as it's defined in state law, I-STEP is a whole testing program. So, when we're looking at a new testing program, have there been discussions yet about, I think WIDA is not changing, but what are the options going to be, or what might the conversation be around tests for students with mild, moderate, severe cognitive disabilities? I know we've had tests in the past that we've kind of seen fall off.
The same. So as I understand 1395, please correct me if I'm wrong, it really is about the Indiana assessment system. And for us, the assessment system includes I-STEP, I-READ, which is for third grade, and then our I-STAR exam, which is for our 1% most severe and profound students with disabilities. So as I understand it, the assessment committee will be looking at all of the, and the ECAs, the design of what happens at the high school right now, the 10th grade I-STEP or whatever that's going to become. So all of those components, as I understand it, would be on the table for discussion.
For the applied skills in the scoring, there's the human factor that can make the grading unreliable. How can this be improved?
The way the scores are trained and the back reads that are done, because it isn't just some person handed a stack of tests, or they log in and they read this essay, the same essay, thousands of times. They have to go through a rigorous training process, and they have to do what's called check sets, and they have to, which are essentially score items, passages that have already been scored, and they have to score them accurately. But while they're scoring, they're also sent sort of back reads. They're also sent passages that have already been scored, and they have to consistently continue to score those as they're slid into what they're scoring, so that they don't drift, and if they drift, then they get rescored or whatever. But it's not just, they do go through a rigorous training. There is a rigorous rescoring or a check throughout the scoring process. And then in Indiana, we allow for a rescore. If parents, once they get the results back, they read through the essay, they don't agree with the score, they can request a rescore. And that is was in the I-STEP law, which has now gone away. But,
Can I interject on the rescore? One of my colleagues asked me to bring this up this evening. The rescore process this year was a big deal for us, because the way rescores worked this year was that parents had to initiate, and they have to initiate online. And so when you are in a district like I'm in, we have a high number of poor students. And so that puts those students at a disadvantage, because their parents have to initiate. and they may not have the technology available for them to initiate. So I'm hoping that as we move forward, that would be one of the things that we could address as well.
And I guess I just want to clarify that the parent requesting the rescore has existed for several years. So that wasn't a change. The only change that what happened this year was they had to do it online. And the reason we had to do it online this year was really aligned to what happened when our legislature and our governor required kind of that last minute a shorter test. So we had to go to a new system of basically what was going to be released and how we did that in a very quick way to try to get some results back to schools. If we don't think that the computer request part is the best for parents, I think that certainly can be revisited. But the parents requesting the rescore has been a part of Indiana's process for several years.
It's actually in statute. And Indiana didn't have a way back in the day for parents to do this, and they had been building, quite honestly, the system had been building to incorporate a parent possible option for years and years. The technology simply had to catch up for them to get there. In this interim, though, our teachers' principals were still having to go in and do the request, but they were required per statute to contact parents, have the parents identify which items they wanted rescored and so forth. The request still had to come from, and they still had to document all of that when they contacted the parent, when the parent said what items and so forth. So Danielle's correct. It's been required, but the process, it's a lot different contacting a parent and then you going in versus relying on a parent who's also very busy and maybe isn't as big a...
Or who can't speak the language.
Or can't speak the language or whatever, relying on them to it. So, I don't know.
Another question, I'm actually going to, this person asked two, so we'll give someone else a shot first. This is a question from Twitter. Teachers already use in-class assessments to get quick formative data. What is the value add for a state test with the same goal? And we kind of talked about this, but to sum it up, what would you say?
I guess I gave my really passionate answer a few minutes ago about that, which is I don't see the benefit. I see teachers getting a lot of valuable information, as this person has described, in many, many formal ways, and even formal ways through formative approaches every single day in their classrooms. So I'll let somebody else take a stab at it.
For me, it comes down to the minute you start layering on stakes, you up the requirement for a valid and reliable assessment. And while those assessment results that they get back that are quick and easy and wonderful for them making decisions within the classroom, large scales broadly questionable on the validity and reliability. And once you start rolling that out across the state, alignment to standards and so forth. So we must have a valid and reliable assessment that fully assesses our standards. And you don't get that with a quick in and out test.
So do you want to add
That
something?
we still need to have a summative test, both by the law, and there is some value in it for parents to know where their kids stand and for researchers to identify where best practices are working, where they're not. But yeah, we all agree the teacher needs to have formative tests, and it's not inconsistent. Let's just do the summative as cheaply and quickly as we possibly can and have more of a focus on the formative.
And I think this is actually a good follow to that question. This person's saying achievement tests are not a valid indicator of teacher effectiveness or school quality, which we've kind of, I think the panel has spoken to tonight. So why do federal and state legislators support them? And to me, this kind of gets at the question of, we've already seen our accountability be altered because of circumstance. Why do we continue to use a system perhaps that that clearly can be changed when is necessary?
Federal legislation does completely fall away from teacher evaluation being linked to the state assessment. So right now, this is going to be at the state's doorstep to take a bold stance on where assessment related to teacher evaluation and teacher compensation may play out, because the federal ESSA language does completely do away with Principle 3, and Principle 3 has always been about teacher evaluation and doesn't exist anymore.
So
And I would say it is a factor, and that's not the factor, and we should need to the state's role can be to share those best practices and help local units come up with different options for those evaluation models.
And I would like to applaud Chad. Washington Township, he brought this up briefly, but right now our local school districts do have lots of flexibility on what they do include in their teacher evaluation systems, and Washington Townships is one of those promising practices that has been elevated by the state. And so you're right, we are looking at, through our promising practices and announcing through state board recognition, those school districts that are moving away from the indicators within a teacher's evaluation system. So it does exist. I think right now it just doesn't exist broadly enough because we probably need some kind of statewide, I would say, message that it is okay to move away from an assessment being tied to teacher evaluation. Because even though Washington Township has done what they've done and others similarly, we still have our multi-million-dollar teacher performance monies tied to student test results. So even though Washington Township can rate their teachers effective and highly effective, the money in which we give teachers is tied to student test results in bonuses.
And then the kind of last question, not quite a question, but I'll make it a question. I think what the person is getting at is, what is the added value here for the community when we talk about testing, and now with a new opportunity for a different test, what does the community gain from this?
We're spending several $billions of taxpayer dollars on education, and I would think those constituents would want to make sure they're getting return for their money. And we have in our state constitution, we want to have a common school system, and it's the largest item of the budget is a priority, and we want to make sure we're succeeding. And as I say, you're not going to know if you're succeeding or not. What's your measure?
I think it's not, right? So I think that's the elephant in the room, that I think there is no value added to the community in terms of the grades that we give schools. I think when you investigate the data, Cynthia and I have had several discussions about this, I think there are definite trends there that give schools who serve disadvantaged populations grades that are not fair or equitable. And so I think it's a way, unfortunately, to label schools in a way that I don't think really describes what's happening in those buildings. So I think it really doesn't add any value.
Well, you could if it were implemented and we had the measurements aligned with what we're trying to accomplish there.
I think it would be challenging to find research that validates using these assessments to evaluate schools and districts and teachers.
Well, I commented before, it's not the measure, and encourage having other measures, but certainly whether kids are learning standards or not and mastering are something that the public should know as well as teachers and parents.
I would argue it's the thermometer. It's the thermometer. Just like you take your temperature, it's the thermometer. It doesn't tell you what's wrong. Doesn't even necessarily tell you if you're sick. There can be multiple reasons why your temperature might be elevated a little.
But you wouldn't want to use a broken thermometer.
Right, precisely. But it's a thermometer, and it shouldn't be the end-all, be-all. I believe the multiple measures idea, I believe there needs to be something beyond. Whether it's a locally created, whether it's a large-scale, whatever assessment, it's a thermometer, and it should, if you're seeing something that doesn't look quite right, then you need to dig further. Doesn't answer all the questions, it raises questions, but dig further and find out where there's smoke, there's fire, if it's just somebody lit a cigarette and didn't put it out properly, who knows? But,
I think that might be where we have to end tonight. But I just wanted to let you guys know, I hope you walked away with some more information than you might have had, or at least some more rationale for things you already knew. Kind of going forward, this next 6 months, the next legislative session are going to be focusing on this, so I hope you'll keep up with Chalkbeat, with WFYI, and stay tuned for other things that we have coming up, because I know that I'll keep reporting on it, and I'll keep asking them questions. So if you have other questions for us or for them, feel free to get in touch with us, and I can do my best to help. So thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for everyone who showed up to participate and ask questions. And then thank you again to Gail and Carly and Melanie at the Public Library and my colleagues at Chalkbeat. And then also our sponsors tonight, the Institute for Quality Education and the Mind Trust. Thanks so much, guys. We hope to see you again soon.